Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. Today I'm speaking with my friends David Noel and Leif Rogers, partners and co-founders at Red Phoenix Entertainment, a firm that bridges American sports and entertainment with emerging markets by connecting sports stars, celebrities, and musicians with global companies and brands, helping to expand sponsorships, branding, and market presence across Asia for American brands, stars in sports, and vice versa, back in America for Chinese sports stars and brands. In this episode, we discuss the opportunity available to sports brands and the sports themselves that's present and clear in China market today, how they help purely domestic Chinese corporate entities build presence in America through sporting sponsorships, the importance of using agencies to go cross-border as local market Sherpas, and their 5 tiers of brand building success. David, what is your favorite Chinese brand and why?
Yeah, my favorite Chinese brand would have to be Li Ning, the sports apparel company. There's a lot of reasons for that. We, Red Phoenix, are a sports company ourselves, and Li Ning has their history rooted in sports. The founder was a Chinese Olympian. But really, the reason why I'm so impressed by the brand is their willingness to look outside of the box and really buck the typical Chinese trend. And they're very active with American sports. They're also stepping into the American entertainment space and constantly redefining themselves and pushing out products that, frankly, are very competitive against the big American shoe companies and apparel companies.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Okay, welcome back to the show, everybody. As you know, I'm here with David and Leif. David and Leif, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We're excited to be here.
As usual, I want to get our guests' China story. So, Leif, why don't I start with you? You and I actually go way back. You spent a lot of time in Dalian. You lived in Dalian. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up in China and your days with the Bank of Jinzhou and such.
I arrived in August of 2005 into the Tier 3 city of Jinzhou on a 1-year contract, and I didn't even know if I was going to last that long. And I was consulting for an alternator company that had signed a contract with GM and doing any job on the side I could to make money while I was there. And through that process, I worked for a couple other companies consulting for them and met the president of the Bank of Jinzhou. And at that time, he'd gone through 3 British and Hong Kongese bankers that only lasted a couple of weeks at the bank. And I was kind of the last shot for the bank and to develop their international department and attract foreign companies to the Bank of Jinzhou. And I ended up staying with the bank for 12 years.
Wow. Okay. And David, what about you? How did you end up in China? When? What were you doing when you got there? That kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. So this was back in 2011, right in the middle of the economic crisis here in the U.S. And I was a recent college graduate and, just trying to figure out, what career path I wanted. The job market was very slow here. There weren't a lot of options, just struggling to really get by. And I saw, meanwhile in the news every day about China and their economy growing. And it just really, it was kind of a naive idea I had, but I said to myself, I just need to get over to China and see what's going on. And, I've always appreciated traveling and just wanted to do something different. So at that time, I started talking to people who had gone to China and figured out, how they did it and what they had done. And I came into connection with somebody who recruited English teachers to teach in different provinces throughout China. So I convinced my then girlfriend, now my wife, to come with me, and we quit our jobs and essentially moved to a place that I had never been, and I didn't speak a word of Chinese. And I had taught English there for about a year. and really enjoyed it. I had actually met Leif during that time in China, and we, grew a very strong friendship together. And at that time, I decided I wanted to go back to America and go to graduate school, but I decided to focus my master's on China itself. So I studied Chinese international affairs and business, and came back to America and went throughout my grad program and worked for a few years in banking afterwards, but ended up with Red Phoenix and with being Leif's partner, going back to China quite frequently. So over the past, I'd say 7 or 8 years, I've been in China quite a bit.
May I ask, from of somebody who has studied, what did you call it, Chinese international affairs and business? Mm-hmm. What do you think is the biggest difference between things that they were teaching or that you learned and what is actually boots on the ground, the reality of doing business in China?
That's funny. I don't, from the international affairs perspective, I mean, I've never worked in politics or for the government, so I can't quite answer that. I mean, it was a very interesting graduate program, but from the business side, to be honest, I don't think I ever took one good class on Chinese business, because I just don't think it's been studied enough, or at least maybe it changes so quickly that there's not really a science to it. It's more, I mean, to be completely frank, it's more of a slog. I mean, you just have to go in there and not give up and try to adapt and try to learn on your feet. So what I did learn a lot was through my Chinese language courses, or just, studying the culture itself.
Okay, guys, so you're both partners and co-founders at Red Phoenix Entertainment. Talk to us about what it is that Red Phoenix Entertainment does.
Yeah, sure. So Red Phoenix Entertainment is we serve as a bridge between American professional sports and China. And you can really boil that down into a few different areas. So one of those areas is helping Chinese brands to secure sponsorships with professional sports teams here in the States. Another area is helping those brands to secure endorsements with professional athletes. And a third area is doing athlete exchanges and media productions. And so that's more of a creative box. We've led athletes on brand building tours throughout China, helped secure different sorts of events with community events or with media. We've also produced a number of documentaries and sports-related media content. So really what we try to do is create a secure and trusted bridge for both the Americans and the Chinese to engage with each other. And in the sports world, it's not a heavily regulated space. And so there's a lot of, uncertainty, I would say, both from the American side as well as the Chinese side. And so what we attempt to do is make it a safe, easy way for brands and sports teams and sports players to engage with each other.
So would you say you're in the business of American brand building, American sports brand building in China?
I would say that's definitely that's one side of the same coin. So yeah, certainly it's American sports brand building in China. And on the other side of that, it would be Chinese corporate brand building here in the United States.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about how do you do that other side of the coin? How do you do Chinese corporate brand building in America?
Back to David's earlier answer that, we always just try to eliminate the nonsense from both sides. And so serve as a true bridge company between the Asian market and the US market. Obviously, I mean, China is probably 90% of our focus, but we're also active in Korea, Japan, Indonesia, other Southeast Asian countries. Saying that, for building a corporate presence here, you have three types of brands in the sports space. You have your big global brands that are, obviously selling them to a global audience that are trying to expand their brand in the U.S. market. But probably, I would say, a good 60 to 70% of our endorsements and sponsorships are actually brands that are purely domestic. And this is strictly due to streaming and technology that on all these platforms over in Asia, and whether it's Tencent or Alibaba, you have NHL, NBA, specific teams that are always streamed or put on their networks. And so they're not necessarily appealing to an American audience. They may be thinking about that for the future, but they're appealing just to their own domestic audience, but putting it on such a large, grand scale in the U.S., which is kind of the premier of obviously basketball or, these other premier sports leagues, sets them above and beyond their domestic competitors.
Another point I would just add to what Leif had said, and to answer your question, Todd, about how we approach Chinese brands. What's interesting is it's like using different sides of your brain in a sense. So when we're working with American organizations or players to build their brand in Asia, it's a much more American approach. I mean, we sit down, we try to outline a roadmap, really the goals that they are trying to obtain and actionable steps on how we can take them there. Now, dealing with Chinese brands, at least from my own perspective, it's much less straightforward. It's going to be very difficult to sit down with the brand and have them sit there and tell you, hey, here's my goal and here's my strategy and here's my roadmap. It's just not something that's commonly done. And so we have to rely, I would say, a lot more on almost intuition or even understanding of the Chinese culture and the Chinese psyche as much as you can do that, right? And we have Chinese partners, we have Chinese employees. Leif and I have lived in China and we spend a lot of time there. And so that, I think, is a trickier service to add, but it's something that we certainly try to do, and we've been pretty happy with what we've done so far.
Yeah, you're right. It does take relationships and the relationship building side of it. How would you compare, and dive a little deeper into the comparison between building a relationship with the Chinese companies to help them, do business here or wherever, versus developing the relationships with the North American, whether it's the sport brands, the NFL, Major League Baseball, whoever, to help them go over there. Just in that process of building the relationship, how does it differ?
Finding the decision maker in a Chinese organization, whether that's medium size, even SMEs, and finding, peeling back that layers of onion to find who is the power behind the structure and the relationship to who the investors are and all that takes us. It's a very long and tough battle for us to do with every organization. Then just due to the culture, and we experience this with all Asian brands, they might be just using Red Phoenix to quote a price, but they actually have, an agency that they're already that they have some relationship with. And so we spend so much time, going through the layers to find the people that matter in an organization, and then also vetting out that organization to see if it's, a legitimate bid or not, or a request. So with China, what I see so many American industries doing it, and Todd, and you as well, you have so many that they make their one trip over there and, they visit Beijing or Shanghai, or maybe they've made two trips and, they've got China figured out, and then they expect to do it all the business from here. And it's just impossible, I would say, in Asia together, but especially in China, where it requires a constant presence and a constant going and visiting not just Beijing or whatever, but where their headquarters or their factories are, and getting to know the brands. And then through that process, you get to know the decision makers. And if you take my bank, for example, I worked for the Bank of Jinzhou for 12 years. There was one, maybe two decision makers in a company of 24,000. And one of those was in the city of Jinzhou, where headquarters was, and the other one was in Beijing. If you had to pick a third, even kind of so decision maker, he was in Beijing as well. So, and he was not in the top 10 of the bank in formal leadership structure. He was would be the equivalent of the 11th or 12th, but he retained so much power to who he was and what he'd done for the bank. He was the next in line to be president of the bank.
What would you say is Red Phoenix's secret sauce?
I mean, I think it's being on the ground and knowing the culture. There's so many frustrating things on the American side that I perceive from their eyes. And it's why we've been able to break into Korea right away, is we've identified what's annoying about American industry and American sports industry especially. So when we go approach these brands, we know their pain points. We know what's difficult for them, and we understand how frustrating. It's frustrating for me, and I'm an American myself. But it drives me, the pace over here drives me absolutely insane. The amount of emails, the amount of legal that you have to deal with on a contract, and the expenses relating to that legal. And for stuff that's, 99.99% never going to happen. And this is frustrating for many of our clients. And so when we approach a brand, that it might be just tackling that one thing, and that gains their trust, and we produce an endorsement or content or whatever that activation is that they like, and then it opens the doors to other things.
Yeah, and I would just, to echo Leif's point, I mean, so much of it, I don't know that it's secret sauce as much as it is just perseverance. I mean, I think every company needs some moments where they get lucky or they have good timing, and we've certainly had some of those moments, but we've had probably even more moments of projects that did not develop, or projects that kind of fell through. And it's really tough. I mean, especially in the sports world, these deals take months and sometimes years to develop, and just to get to the point where you're negotiating a contract out. And then for them to fall apart due to something, it could be anything. It could be something with the trade war, or it could be, the brand just decided it wasn't the right time. And it can really feel devastating at moments when you've put so much blood, sweat, and tears into these deals, and you've traveled so much and you've spent so many hours away from your family. It can be really tough. And I think that a lot of companies that decide to try to do business in Asia in general, once they get a couple of those stings, they may tell themselves, well, maybe it's just not for me. And that's something that Red Phoenix has never done. I mean, there have certainly been times where we've wanted to do that, but we've just always stayed at it. And I think because of that, we've had some really exciting projects as well. So really, I think it's perseverance, and it's being able to build a team that has expertise in both cultures. And again, I mean, Leif and I are both Americans, but we have Chinese partners, we have Chinese employees. And I mean, you could argue that Leif is just as much Chinese as he is American, at least in terms of how many years he's lived there. So I think we do a pretty good job at bridging both cultures.
Guys, can you speak to the importance of using an agency like yourselves, or even WPIC Marketing Technologies? Just speak a little bit to the value add, or the examples of why it's important to go with people who understand the landscape and know how to navigate the local landscape.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think we could have an entire podcast just on this one subject. And it's similar to why, you wouldn't probably do surgery on your own leg. Rather than going to a doctor. I mean, you really need somebody who understands the landscape and how it works. And all you need to do is look at the news to see ample examples of American companies that are misstepping or kind of blundering in China. And, look, I mean, it can happen to anybody, but you certainly, I would think, if you're going to invest your time and resources into China, you would want to have somebody to help guide you. And, I'll just give one example. And not to pick on any one league in particular, but I mean, you look at, a league like the NHL or the NFL, who are, just hugely successful here in the West. And they've had kind of slow starts over in China. And, I think a big part of that is because both hockey and American football just aren't big sports in China to begin with. It's not really part of the culture. But having said that, they've certainly spent a lot of money trying to develop those leagues on the surface level, but I don't know how much they've really rolled up their sleeves, so to speak, and really truly engaged with the Chinese and Chinese culture. And as an example of that, I mean, we recently brought Adrian Peterson, the running back from the NFL, to China, and we spent a lot of time trying to convince organizations to support that push. But in the end, it was really our company that led him there, that, we rolled up our sleeves. We did a lot of community events and clinics and just really trying to engage with the Chinese. And as a result of that, he became the second most followed NFL player in China. And I mean, you're talking over a 1 week trip that our team organized. And I'm not saying that that we have all the right answers, but what I am saying is that you certainly want to attempt to understand the culture and the marketplace there before you go there. And Leif, I'm sure that you have plenty of stories to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, in my time in China, I was also initially the vice chairman, the chairman of the American Chamber, and my job allowed me to I was pretty much in a different city almost every day. And so foreign companies in general, there's some countries that I feel do it better than others, but North American companies, I would say, I don't know the statistics on it. I don't have the numbers, but just from my own experience, probably 9 out of 10 fail within the first year or maybe the first 2 years. And all I saw and all I had for customers of my bank were companies that repeatedly fail and oftentimes didn't take the advice of local experts and local companies, whether that be European or Canadian or British, that were successful there. This is what works in America and we're going to stick with it. And yet on the flip side of the coin, you have companies like Dow Chemical that have been very successful in China. And it's, again, a knowledge of the marketplace, a knowledge of culture. And then more importantly, to David's point, is using whether it was their local staff or whatever, and heeding their advice on how to be successful, but still sticking within your company's structure and strategic goals. And so I've seen way more companies fail than I'd ever like to, and lost a lot of customers over the years because of it. But I would have to say out of those 9 out of 10, I'd at least seven or 8 of them failed because they failed and not because China failed them.
What do you think the opportunity is for brands, whether it's sports brands or otherwise, in China? Is the opportunity still as large and as exciting and enticing as it has been?
I would say it's even more exciting. Asia itself, sports is extremely hot right now. They're all, demographically, they're all aging populations. As you well know, Todd, for pretty much for at least the last 100 years, the focus has been on study, and PE and physical activity is kind of was put on the back burner. And that is all, we're seeing it across the board in Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Philippines, China, where fitness, healthy eating, sports activities. We have a partner in Beijing that runs a football, baseball, and hockey camp for children that are like 3 to 7 before they have the pressure of, the intense studying in their school system. And from that, now the elementary schools are asking, hey, can you bring in these programs into, and so it's just a focus all the way around just healthy and fitness, not to mention that you have the Winter Olympics in 2022 in Beijing, you have the Tokyo Olympics this year. And then more importantly, it's just our modern millennial age of access to all those platforms and all those different sports. Before, it was what was on CCTV5, and that's what it was either soccer, badminton, ping pong, or basketball. And now, because of all these different streaming platforms, they have access to UFC and horse riding and skateboarding and extreme sports, and all of these are taking off again across Asia. And so these little niches are just blossoming, and a lot of brands that aren't your big, huge Nike, Adidas, these type of brands, but could be a snowboard brand that if they do it and they do it right, they're flourishing over there. And we're seeing that across China and across Asia.
In the world of sports and brand building that you guys have been doing, what has been the most effective way for you to be able to help a brand build its presence in a place like China?
We tend to hit that on 5 tiers. It's when we're brand building, it's media, it's on the ground activities like grassroots initiatives, camps, etc. It's meeting with the brands directly. The power of that is so misunderstood here in the US, where, they would have no interest in the NFL or, whatever league that is. But if you're on the ground meeting them and their executives with that, you watch how fast they become a fan of that team or a fan of that sport. And just by being there on the ground. The other one that a lot of people overlook is government relations. As you all know, Todd, government in China is everything. And that's, they control the state-owned industries. They control the message, what, the initiatives are and all that. And having government relations can build so much in the forms of sponsorship and activation and strategy for all these brands. And then we have a deal with Linglong Tire with the NHL. And while that was a big feather in our caps, because Chinese, even their global sponsors, haven't really ventured into the NHL, with the exception of ORG Packaging, which he's just a massive fan of hockey and played hockey himself. This was like the first, real brand that has approached the NHL. And if, as much as that was strategy and they chose Tampa Bay for the location in the South, because that's where the tire industry is so focused, with all the car dealerships and tire factories and all the racing and everything down there. I would say probably 60% of that decision was because of the Winter Olympics and trying to please the central government of China.
Talking about building sports brands in China, that's such a unique perspective to what most people are doing over there. So I'm interested to know, where's the money flowing? Is it going into the textiles? Is it going into the swag, the t-shirts, the hoodies? Is it going into camps? Is it going into sports fields and league operations? Is it all being spent on Taobao, Tmall? Talk to me a little bit about where the opportunity is and what's happening as far as the money flow and the monetary side of it.
Yeah, I mean, the money is everywhere, to answer your question. And I mean, if you look at the numbers that the Chinese government have projected onto how big the sports industry is growing, I don't have it in front of me, but it's absolutely mind-boggling how they project the sports industry to grow. And this has been a very deliberate approach by the Chinese central government to grow this industry. And what's so interesting about your question, Todd, is that we can talk about sports and marketing, but really it's a reflection of China as a whole. So many people think of China still in the West as the world's, manufacturer, and it's really just changing so quickly. And so much of their technology is leapfrogging ours. And China, being very kind of smart and wise about this, sees the potential of sports and how much that can impact its population. And so they've been deliberately growing the entire sports economy. And so to answer your question, when you look at basketball or soccer, for example, which is just absolutely humongous in China, the money is flowing everywhere. It's flowing back here into America directly to athletes for product endorsements. It's flowing into teams for sponsorships, or into Europe with European football clubs. Back in China, who is actually paying all this money to get endorsements with the athletes? Well, it's financial services. It's, alcohol companies. It's food and clothing and apparel. And it's just really, it's very similar to the American market in that sense. Now, when you talk about other sports, which are starting to grow, like winter sports and ice hockey, or even, things like running and fitness, it's a little bit different, but it's starting to go the way of soccer and basketball. And so what I mean by that is, being in a very kind of early stage, most of the money is more around the educational components or the camps and the clinics, as people are just trying to learn about, well, how do you play ice hockey, or how do you play American football? And so a lot of that money is around that level where, they're just starting to develop parks, or they're building schools and training programs. But as those sports start to gain in popularity, you're going to see the consumer goods products and the financial services products start to take interest once they see that there are a lot of Chinese who are watching those sports or participating. And so it's a very interesting time, because when you look at the U.S., it's so saturated with all of our sports, and they're all pretty much mature to the point where, you just see the big sponsors engaging with it. But in China, you can very clearly see the progression of some sports compared to others. And I think that's that should be a hopeful sign for every sport aside from basketball and soccer. There is a path forward. You just have to do it the Chinese way.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, Todd, that what has been such a breath of fresh air for me after living and working in China for 12 years, and we were in the Northeast, which is the most state-owned enterprise, heavy industrial, is the breath of fresh air for me is the companies that we're working and just kind of the whole business, sports marketing culture in itself over there is the capacity to think outside the box, to start taking on risk, not just copying what the other brand is doing and taking the safe route. That has been such a wonderful experience for me. Now we're dealing with pioneering brands that are, enormous in China and now starting to be enormous globally. And then there's a reason for that. But just the out of the box mindset that the transformation of that, where even just 2 years ago, it was, no, we just want this and we want to copy what the other brand did. And we know that's going to be successful. And now I feel that, and David, if you want to back me up on this, that we're seeing brands across the board, large, small, some state-owned connected, some private, some very small, all trying to come up with a new way and take that risk. And that's been amazing to see in China itself.
I want to ask you guys about what messages are resonating. When you are taking a North American brand to China, let's take one of the big sports one, the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, whoever. What is the strategy around the messaging about the sport that you find is really working, and vice versa? What is the messaging you would give to a brand like a Li Ning or something that is really trying to make its mark and be and have a foothold in North America? What is the messaging that you're recommending them to come back over, bring back with them when they come this way?
The other great thing about since we formed Red Phoenix is battling those misconceptions, even that I harbor myself. And the Adrian Peterson trip was a classic example. Our Chinese staff, our Chinese partners didn't understand the NFL is not popular in China. Why are we doing this? The NFL has been in China for, I believe, 19 years now, and still have yet to hold the game there. And, they do what they can, but it's that old thing, Todd, that you understand well. If you have 0.1% of the population, that's still millions and millions of people. And it's just connecting to those fans. And I surprisingly, in learning all this myself, is the fact that we had the fans in Beijing and Shanghai the opportunity to meet Adrian when he was there on the ground and to send in messages of why Adrian was their favorite player and why they deserved to meet him. And just the knowledge of the NFL was dumbfounding to me. We were talking to kids that appeared, because he ended up meeting a couple in Beijing and a couple in Shanghai, that they knew more about the sport than I ever did, and probably more than Todd, or David knows. I mean, they knew where the NCAA, where they came up from. They knew the who was on their practice roster. They were sitting there naming plays, and it wasn't scripted. It wasn't like they looked up Adrian Peterson on Wikipedia, which really resonated with Adrian because he obviously remembered that one play when he was playing the Broncos. And so they're immediately hitting it off. And this was just the fans that wrote in on this one, chance to meet Adrian. And I mean, there was a guy in Beijing who had a mural of Adrian Peterson painted on his Beijing apartment. And it's just those misconceptions from both sides. Same thing with the Chinese brands. The Chinese brands, the NFL is not popular. Oh, the NHL is not popular. And we're showing them, no, not only is it popular here, and there is a huge population, and for like the NHL, the government is supporting it, and all those touch points, but teaching them that, hey, if you're the first one to endorse the NFL, or you're the first one to endorse a player in the NFL, that's much more of an ROI than just sponsoring some bench player for a team in Portland or something that you're not going to, you're just one of many brands. That choosing the safe route is as harming to them as and then the misconceptions of what the results of that are going to be are on both sides are a big challenge, but it's also a great thing to experience and change that way of thinking.
Yeah, and my take on that too is when we're talking to athletes or teams who want to develop their Chinese brand, what we say is it's not. China has matured enough that it's not enough just to be famous and go there and voila, you build your brand. I mean, yeah, sure, there are some people like the Kobe Bryants who, of course they can keep doing that. But, if you're an athlete, you're not the first famous person to visit China. And so you need to start engaging the Chinese culture. And the success that we've seen with athletes and teams are usually centered around, hey, look, we're this famous player, we're this famous team, but we're here in China and we're engaging with you. And so that sounds kind of elementary, but it's pretty true. I mean, you need to engage them on a cultural level and make it look like you're actually happy to be there, right? I mean, you can't you can't just kind of do a passive trip or a passive endorsement because the fans they're gonna pick up on that and they're pretty quickly going to say, well, you're not that interesting. And so I think the American side needs to step up their game and start treating the Chinese marketplace like a more sophisticated consumer base and really try to understand what their motivations are and the demographics, et cetera. On the flip side, what I see the Chinese companies really needing to do, especially as they're looking to build their brands abroad, is they need to shed that stereotype of Chinese quality, right? And we all know it. I mean, when you buy a Chinese product, how long is it going to last when it's set next in comparison with a German product or, a Canadian product, et cetera. But we, at the same time, we know that the Chinese are starting to make, and they have been making very good products in their tech space. They have a lot of really interesting things coming out there that, again, are leapfrogging Western technology. And so I think the Chinese need to start branding in a way that they can shed that stereotype of low quality. All we're ever going to do is copy other brands. And they need to start pitching themselves as innovative companies. And a way to do that is to go outside of just the traditional marketing trends in China. And to Leif's point, start associating yourself with unique sports and unique players, et cetera. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And, when I answered the question about who's my favorite company in China, and when we talk about Li Ning, that's exactly why we think that they're such an interesting company, is because they're really bucking the trend when it comes to doing partnerships with really interesting, unique brands and players.
Okay, so guys, we're talking about sports, and obviously there was a very important social media event where there was a tweet that got the NBA in a bit of a hot water. And so that just speaks to cultural misunderstandings, I would say. And as a couple of individuals and an entity like Red Phoenix Entertainment that is taking brands and trying to help them develop in other areas of the world where they're not as well known, how much importance and how do you guys help those companies understand how to do and navigate the nuances and the delicateness of certain topics, let's say?
Yeah, with regards to the tweet, I mean, goes back to the point with having Sherpa. I mean, whether you're on either side, nobody was right or wrong in this. It's just understanding the marketplace and the impact of what a tweet can do that could be conceived as perfectly harmless. And you're right, as a citizen here, I don't think the impact was understood on that particular case. And I don't think it's our social media and how we express ourselves here is that impact is, whether it's an athlete or anyone, how that can impact an entire culture, an entire country, and an entire industry. And so I think that's where it goes back to the Sherpa, to have that advisory, have that consultation, to just let them, to educate them on here are some sensitive topics and why. And I mean, go back to like when they kept John Bon Jovi's plane sitting outside the Shanghai gate with 2 sold out shows in Shanghai and a dream of all of Bon Jovi to play in Shanghai. And they discovered a meme on the drummer's Facebook page, that said something about the Dalai Lama or whatever. And now you're banned from operating or doing these shows. And, every time that we experience this within our sports world, our athletes is, just it's kind of a dumbfounded, well, I had no idea it'd be this big. Well, yeah, yes, it can be that big, and this is why. And I think if you're there to educate, advise, and assist when something like that goes down, it's much better. And ultimately, if you're using a third party, they can bear the risk rather than destroying the brand or the team or whatever that is here.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, so Red Phoenix has always, in every presentation we've given to a team or an athlete, that has always been a cornerstone of our presentation, is that, look, if we're going to take you to China, we need to talk about China, and we need to talk about China's political climate and, some of the hot button issues, and as an individual or a team, how to handle that. And, it's funny. I clearly remember in some of those presentations, that's kind of the part of the presentation where everyone's like, oh, okay, yeah, great. We have to learn about the culture. But I think now more than ever, it's even more apparent on how important that is to understand the culture that you're about to go into. And it doesn't matter if it's China or Japan or, anywhere, even the US. There's certain issues that you have to be aware of. And as a business going in there, you should be well aware of how you should be talking about these issues, if at all. And so it's definitely something that we stress with athletes. And again, to Leif's point, we live in a different society here, and we're not trying to say what's right or wrong. It's just, if you want to do business abroad, you should always know and have insight into the cultures in which you're about to do business in.
Guys, thanks very much for being on the show. Last question. What is your best piece of advice for doing business in China?
Thank you for having us on the show. I hope it was informative and valuable. I'm going to give the same answer that I gave to your first accelerator class years ago in Dalian. Rule number 1, anything is possible in China. Rule number 2, everything is difficult in China. So when you're excited and all eager about entering the new market and everything, see rule number 2. But if you're ready to give up, throw in the towel, and blow your head off, see rule number 1. That's my advice.
David, Leif, how can people get in touch with you, get in touch with Red Phoenix? Where can they share, follow, email? How do they find you?
So our email address is management@redphoenixentertainment.com, and that will come to both Leif and myself.
This was absolutely informative and entertaining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Todd.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co. And be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见。